national insurance cuts implemented by Jeremy Hunt just before the election. Now, if those cuts are implemented and the Lloyds report this kind of poll, that's not good policy, to put it mildly.
Reports from Lebanon say an Israeli drone strike has killed 2 people near the border between the two countries. Israelis have commented. Its Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been considering a rough response to Saturday's deadly rocket attack on the occupied Golan Heights, which killed 12 young people. Israel has blamed the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah, which has denied involvement. The Doctors' Union, the British Medical Association, has said industrial action by GPs could bring the NHS to a standstill. The College of Doctors in England closes today. Further industrial action could include GPs limiting the number of patients they see each day to 25 and not performing work they are formally contracted to do. A far-left activist has been arrested by police investigating sabotage attacks on high-speed rail lines in Paris ahead of the Olympics opening ceremony. A police source said the man was detained in Normandy yesterday and had keys to rail premises. A group of unpaid carers will meet ministers today to talk about changes to the allowance they can claim, because some people have been ordered to pay thousands of pounds. Currently, carers have to pay back the allowance if they earn just a penny above the threshold of £151 a month. BBC News.
Over 60% of banks have closed in the last 9 years, and in an attempt to stem the tide, the Financial Conduct Authority is putting obligations on banks and building societies to ensure that every community has access to cash and banking services, even if local branches close. But will the new regulations work? The question will be examined in new years, starting just after the weekend. But now on Radio 4, Mark Easton explores the tactical arms race between demonstrators and police as we continue our series, Policing Protest.
A statue of the slave trader Edward Colston was pulled from its plinth and dumped into the Bristol Harbour in the COVID summer of 2020. Black Lives Matter demonstrators cheer. In the moment, the police look on. The political, legal and cultural implications of the statue topic were hard to unravel amid the theatrical events of that June afternoon. The Colston Forum argued the statue's display was itself a criminal act of abuse in a multicultural city. The local jury cleared them of criminal damage. But the Home Secretary insisted it was sheer vandalism, public disorder that was a distraction from the cause behind the protest.
I think that is absolutely disgraceful, and that speaks to the act of disorder.
Senior judges later ruled such actions were violent and not protected by human rights law. The acquittals, though, were not overturned.
So you cannot allow the powerful to tell them where you can and can't protest.
Governments is undermining the rights of people to protest and sometimes.
It's when things go wrong very quickly that the police have to react quite quickly, quite dynamically, and there can be a conflict there in terms of what that looks like.
We are at capacity to deal with what we need to deal with.
I'm Mark Easton, and in my 45 years as a journalist, I've reported many times on the disputed lawfulness of protest and the police response to those protests. From the strikes of the 1980s to the direct action of climate activists today.
Five environmental activists who organised protests that caused great on the M25 have been jailed for a total of 21 years.
Imposing long prison sentences on Just Stop Oil protesters recently, a judge said each one had crossed the line from concerned campaigner to fanatic.
Placards and cheers for Just Stop Oil protesters arriving in a van for sentencing at Southwark Crown Court today.
But who decides where that line should be? Because the right to speak out against the state, to protest and disrupt, is arguably part of the bedrock of democracy itself. So how should the police, who marshal the boundaries of the right to protest, fulfill their statutory responsibilities? To help me get there, I'm joined by former Police Assistant Commissioner Rob Beckley. Rob, it does seem that the new measures brought in almost specifically against the actions of the people at Just Stop Oil resulted in some extremely tough sentences. Is it your sense that some kind of threshold has been reached for the sort of tolerance of protest?
From my experience, I don't think it's the police driving an anti-protest agenda. They do respond to the framework that's provided by legislators, and they feed cases into the criminal justice system. And it's the collective response of the whole system that can have that effect. What's called a chilling effect on protest. There is a danger that punitive response to protest drives things underground, that people take anonymous action, and there's less to lose, so they ratchet up their response.
And all this, of course, on top of the sheer volume of protest at the moment, not just the Just Stop Oil direct action, but we've seen demonstrations, sit-ins, counter-protests. Police have been calling the levels chronic.
I perceive that my colleagues are struggling with the amount and the nature of what's going on the streets. What we're seeing at the moment is it escalating, it's growing in strength. Tactics are changing and evolving yet again. I don't yet think we've reached the peak.
As we've come to define freedom of dissent only in terms of the mobilization of ideas, then our intolerance of dissent as disruption has grown. Alex Vitale, I'm a criminologist based at Brooklyn College, and I've been writing about policing issues for the last 30 years. I think it's helpful to think about protests in two somewhat distinct categories. One is those demonstrations that have received state approval, that have permits, that have a plan that's been coordinated with the police department, which means that they've agreed to a whole set of restrictions about place, time, manner of protest. The other type of protests are those that do not conform to that system of close and tight police regulation of the expression of dissent. This might involve a sit-in across a bridge. And so anything that is seen as a disruption of business as usual, but when we've created a political dynamic that excludes so many important and widely held ideas, then we will see invariably the rise of disorderly and disruptive protest.
My name's Sarah. I'm lying on the road here, just outside of Farnborough Airport. My left arm is chained inside an oil barrel. There's somebody on the other side of the oil barrel. And we're basically obstructing the entrance to this gate of the airport because we feel so strongly that basically at this time of climate crisis, it's absolute madness to have private jets flying in and out of the country and releasing enormous amounts of emissions. I am aware that looking on is now an offence. Actually, we're on private land right at the moment, and I feel very, very strongly about this, so I'm willing to risk that.
I'm Rick Muir, I'm Director of the Police Foundation, which is an independent policing think tank. In this strategic review of policing, which the Police Foundation conducted in 2022, we found that there's been a rise in both the number of protest events and also an increase in the number of protest events involving confrontational tactics, which obviously poses a very big challenge for the police because they have to balance this issue of upholding public order with also facilitating people's right to protest. there's been a series of issues that have been put on the agenda that have risen in salience, about which people feel very strongly. Black Lives Matter, the murder of George Floyd in America had a huge impact. There was lots of protest activity that flowed from that. The other big thing that's happened is climate change. And we've seen out of that the rise of Just Stop Oil, the rise of Extinction Rebellion. These are moral issues about which people feel very strongly. And where they feel they therefore have a duty to engage in more confrontational tactics.
So Mel Carrington from Just Stop Oil.
Your movement is very much about direct action. What does that actually mean?
So direct action is about disruption. It's either about disrupting physical spaces, so doing property damage, stopping people going about their business, stopping business as usual, or it's about spectacle. So the Stonehenge action, for example, was a spectacle. We didn't actually do any damage.
What we've seen over the last few years, largely in response to the activities of environmental groups, including Intellect Britain and Just Stop Oil, has been new legislation, the Criminal Justice Act, which came in a year or so ago, was very obviously a consequence of the kind of actions that you've taken.
We have to react to what is put in front of us, and this last government in particular has changed the legislation several times in order to prevent us exercising our rights to protest. Our supporters are prepared to break the law. They do so non-violently, but they do so in full knowledge of accepting the consequences. So we are accountable for our actions. We expect to have the full force of the law applied. What we don't expect is for governments to be constantly repressing in the sense of eroding our rights to protest.
New laws passed by the previous Conservative government have given the police considerable new powers to deal with demonstrations. Powers to regulate the duration of protest, to close down protests on the basis they're too noisy, lowering the bar of what counts as serious disruption, allowing a good deal of operational leeway. Against these changes is human rights legislation. Incorporated into British law in 2000, this protects the right to assembly and the right to free expression, which, in effect, combine to create a right to protest. Now, the police frame this challenge of rights and new legal powers as a matter of balance. But given the punitive sentences meted out to Just Stop Oil activists, is the law and the justice system now moving against protest?
I'm Matt Twist, I'm the Assistant Commissioner for Met Operations and Performance, the senior officer with overall responsibility for the policing of major events and protest in London. We attempted to use conditions, and what happened with that approach was that we would impose conditions, the group would comply with it for a short period of time, and then go and do something else at a slightly different location, which meant a new set of conditions needed to be considered. And so that took too long. Where we actually ended up landing was with Section 7 of the Public Order Act as amended, which was passed by Parliament. So a good example of changing the law so the police can act. We were able to act enormously quickly.
To what extent have you noticed the police changing the way that they operate when they come to one of your demonstrations?
The legislation that they use and their ability to shut down a protest has changed. They're able to move more swiftly. They're able to shut down protests more swiftly. We have less leeway. We get to stay on the road for less long, so less disruption is caused.
Let's take a moment, this moment, to consider why we are here. Let's remember our love for this beautiful planet that feeds,
The stated intent of those protesters over that whole span was to cause the maximum disruption. And in weighing the Human Rights Act, we were able to say that there's a very small number of people here disrupting a much, much larger number of people, in fact, large swathes of the capital. And therefore, the right balance was to enforce the law quickly to remove that serious disruption.
The police keep on coming back to this idea that they have to balance the right to protest with the right of other people to go about their business. Now, you have a right to protest, which is protected by the European Convention on Human Rights and the Human Rights Act. There is no right to simply go about your business. I'm Graham Smith, I'm CEO of Republic, campaign group committed to the abolition of the monarchy. We know this because your business can be disrupted by any number of things, whether it's roadworks, whether it's a royal having the traffic stopped so they can whiz past in their fancy cars with a police escort, or whether it's a protest. And you do not have a right to not have your life disrupted. That isn't a thing. You do have a right to not be stopped from protesting by the police or by the state. That is a very powerful and important right. That is central to our democracy. These acts like the 2023 Public Order Act that bans serious disruption, or protests that cause serious disruption, are very worrying because it's so vague. In most people's minds, what they are talking about is blocking roads and closing down motorways, and there's a whole conversation about the legitimacy of that kind of protest, but they have left it wide open to be interpreted by the police in any manner they wish.
For the police, the justification behind a protest is almost irrelevant. They say their role is simply to enforce the law and keep the peace. But it's never that straightforward. For a start, those objectives can be at odds with each other. Sometimes officers may overlook instances of criminality if to respond might inflame a crowd and risk more serious law breaking. But equally, they may decide to respond with full force, batons and shields, dogs and horses, if they deem a protest has become a significant threat to law and order, as Rob Beckley's been finding out.
We're at the Wilfred Fuller Training Centre in Avon and Somerset, and what we can see is tarmacked roads crisscrossing an area of probably a couple of acres with porta cabins and containers that are made to look like buildings, cars and lorries, buses that are laid out around the site.
Okay, one team. Just run through the safety brief as always.
In these mock streets, the tactics being tested and rehearsed are virtually the same as those I was taught back in 1986.
Oliver Cosgrave, I'm a superintendent, I'm the head of operations in Avon Somerset Police. Today really is about putting all our officers through a scenario where they don't know what's going to happen. They will walk into this site, they'll be met with some people who will throw bricks at them, or, well, they're wooden blocks rather than bricks. Our trainers dress up in riot gear with baseball bats and will try and hit officers, and you have to defend yourself and arrest those people as is necessary.
The authorised professional practice in 2024 still reflects the thinking and quasi-military doctrine built into the first public order manuals drawn up after the disorder in Northern Ireland and the riots in the early 1980s. From long shields, dogs and the use of horses to what is politely called petrol reception.
Petrol reception is one of the few things that you absolutely have to retrain in every year to remain competent as a public order officer. Whilst the training is relatively contained and sterile, people do still get injured in that training.
I'm PC Kerry Rees from Gloucestershire Constabulary. I'm a public order trainer. So we're trying to simulate if we had a extremely hostile
details on these to buy, but it's a unsafe one, a hold to them, give them more trained to rip through skin. It's trained to kind of grab hold of ideally anyone and then hold them until the police officer comes to take them. So my name is Tony Blatchford. I'm a Silver Public Order Commander. When you see a police unit turn up and they've got their helmets on and their visors down and they're wearing a uniform, you know, they all look the same. It looks like it's a large collective of people. What you forget is those are individuals. Their mothers, their fathers, their brothers, their sisters. And they all go through the same human reactions that any human being does. We don't go on a course to have emotion removed. And when you're there in a line and things are being thrown at you, your natural instinct, of course, is to flinch or to try and avoid. But if you avoid that brick coming in or that petrol bomb coming in and you don't allow that to hit your shield and you actually duck, what happens is that petrol bomb then hits the person behind you. So what you're doing is not playing your part, you're becoming the weakest link and you affect the rest of the unit.
Knowing that we have a variety of tactics that can escalate depending on the crowd. Yeah, the crowd can be very chaotic, whereas we can stand there, take our time, use our tactics.
It's difficult to understand if you've never experienced it, but as a police officer you can feel the mood in a large crowd. Emotion, whether it's good humour, tension, or suppressed anger, radiates from a mass of people, and the response of police, whether the intention is helpful, benign or controlling, can ratchet up feelings and has often, when misjudged, been a catalyst for disorder.
Jim Hill, I'm a PSU instructor here at Avon Somerset, and I'm the course coordinator for this PSU course. So police support unit comes from back in the days when we were in the Cold War, when they were concerned about that nuclear issue and central total breakdown of law and order should the country be subject to a nuclear attack. That's where that nomenclature police support unit comes from. So it's all about the police supporting the military in a martial law situation during that. Or the military would have been running the country and taking over the policing organisation based on the fact that it would have all broken down. And the police support units were there to back up as much as possible the military in carrying out that role. So that's where that nomenclature comes from.
On the afternoon of March the 31st, 1990, senior Metropolitan Police officers were discussing crowd control tactics. Up to 250,000 people were attending a rally and march in central London, protesting against the poll tax. It had begun as a peaceful demonstration, but around 4 p.m, a few thousand sat down in Whitehall close to the security gates of Downing Street and ignored police requests to move.
The rioting began when police tried to clear Whitehall after demonstrators refused to move from the entrance to Downing Street. The fighting rapidly escalated.
State authorities are nervous of large crowds, particularly when it's thought they might seek direct confrontation with the government. The 18th century fear of popular revolution still lingers. And so, that day in 1990, frontline officers were ordered to arrest some of those sitting near the heavily policed entrance to Downing Street. The crowd turned angry. Objects were thrown. Mounted riot police were deployed. A rally became a riot.
Police vehicles tracked by the mob were attacked with bricks, bottles and iron bars.
These people are totally against democracy. Those who are against democracy take to the streets.
8 months later, the Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was ousted. The dynamics and psychology of crowds has been part of policing since its creation 200 years ago.
So I think it's impossible to understand protest policing without looking at the historical development of our understanding of the crowd. My name's Clifford Stott. I'm a social psychologist. I specialise in group and crowd psychology and its implications for policing. Our understanding of the crowd, and indeed our need, in a sense, to manage the crowd and to police the crowd, comes about in the 18th and 19th century as a function of the Industrial Revolution. People were migrating from the countryside into the cities, they didn't have political franchise, they didn't have the vote, they often lived in appalling conditions, and they had no ability to affect that through the normal democratic voting process. Their only vehicle for generating political change was the crowd.
One of the key shifts in the 19th century was from policing words and what people said to what they were doing and their actions. Katrina Navikas, I write and research the history of protest and public space. In the early part of this period, the government and the authorities were really concerned with what they called seditious words, what people were saying, particularly around the monarchy and parliament, and this was coming out of a fear of revolution, overturning the monarchy, overturning the elite powers. That fear started to fade by the 1830s, the 1840s, as new ideas around democracy started to be accepted. The power of the crowd was seen to be more threatening than perhaps the power of speech. By this period, we're talking about big demonstrations of hundreds of thousands of people, and this becomes a big issue about policing, of street control, crowd control. How do the authorities deal with these large crowds on the street? And there is fear that there will be riots. The government and the police's attention to crowd control and bodies on the street marks a shift towards what we now know as public order policing, and still exists today as the major way in which crowds are controlled, are understood and are policed during demonstrations. It's about what bodies on the streets do.
What we've known for a considerable amount of time is that policing can inadvertently escalate disorder in crowds. And the reason that happens is because they rely heavily on policing crowds as a whole, on what we might call indiscriminate use of force. It runs the danger of creating an environment where people experience their rights are being confronted, and as a function of that, they come to see the policing that they're experiencing as illegitimate. We know that that perception of illegitimacy of policing is one of the fundamental dynamics of how riots come about.
I think the two are totally different things, actually. I don't think, a protest is a lawful expression of somebody's rights. People have the right to freedom of expression and have the right to assemble. So a protest is a lawful thing. A riot is a crime, in that a riot, as defined by the Public Order Act, describes serious unlawful violence. For me, a riot is large-scale fighting, is looting of property, is things being set on fire, is missiles being thrown.
My name's Adam Elliott Cooper. I'm a writer. I've been involved in protests relating to policing, racism, including the Black Lives Matter movements in the UK. Many of the so-called riots in places like the US in the 1960s, Britain in the 1980s, have been reframed as being rebellions by people from the communities in which these uprisings emerged. And part of the reason for that is because a riot can emerge potentially out of nothing. A rebellion is something which is a reaction to something and forces people to think more carefully about the context. What are those people rebelling against? What was the spark that led to this violent response? In 2011, a young man called Kingsley Burrell died of asphyxiation in Birmingham at the hands of the police. The reggae artist Smiley Culture died during a police raid on his home. And then in the August of that year, most famously, Mark Duggan, a young black man from Tottenham in North London, was shot and killed by police.
Mark was not the first person to die at the hands of the police. We must also remember all of those other deaths in custody that have had justice. So what we all need to do is remember them too.
All three of these deaths led to black-led protests, but of course only one of them, the third, also led to widespread rebellions.